Quantum suicide. Quantum suicide is a thought experiment that merges the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics with the unsettling theme of life and death. To understand its premise, it helps to recall that the many worlds interpretation suggests that every time a quantum event has multiple possible outcomes, the universe splits into different branches, each one reflecting a distinct result. Imagine a simple scenario. A radioactive atom either decays or does not decay within a certain time span. Under a conventional view, we speak in terms of probabilities. Under the many worlds lens, every outcome occurs in a separate universe. Quantum suicide applies this notion to an extremely stark setup. The idea is as follows. You have a device that measures whether a subatomic particle decays, and based on that, decides the life or death of the participant. For instance, if the particle decays, the machine triggers a lethal mechanism. If it does not, the participant survives. It may sound like a quantum-based game of Russian roulette, but the key lies in how the many worlds interpretation frames measurement and consequences. Each time the particle has the chance to decay or not, two parallel realities would form, one in which the participant dies and one in which they continue living. The paradox emerges when you focus on the personal experience of the participant. According to this perspective, in every measurement, there is always at least one branch where they remain alive. In the branches where they die, they have no awareness at all, and thus from the subjective standpoint, it can feel like they survive indefinitely. This has prompted some to speak of quantum immortality, hinting that from the observer's vantage point, they never experience their own death, even though in many branches they do in fact perish. They simply have no consciousness of those universes. Most scientists and philosophers view quantum suicide as a speculative thought experiment rather than proof of any genuine immortality. It highlights the strange implications of many worlds if taken to its limits, especially in merging quantum mechanics with fundamental ideas about life and death. From a common-sense, probabilistic view, each trial carries a strong likelihood of resulting in death eventually. Yet subjectively, the argument goes, the participant only notices the branches where they remain alive. Hence, quantum suicide throws into relief the tension between an objective statistic, where you would almost certainly die if you repeated the process, and a purely subjective viewpoint that insists you perceive survival in at least one branch. The result is a bizarre reflection on how quantum theory, in certain interpretations, can shake our deepest intuitions about mortality and personal experience. While there is no suggestion that anyone should put this to the test, its conceptual power underscores the capacity of theoretical physics to upset our familiar assumptions and push us to reconsider the boundaries of what we call reality. The problem of induction. The problem of induction challenges a central pillar of both everyday reasoning and scientific practice: the notion that the future will resemble the past. We typically assume the sun will rise tomorrow, that gravity will continue acting the same way, and that patterns observed repeatedly so far will not suddenly change. The question arises, though, as to why we accept this assumption so confidently. The philosopher David Hume famously argued that there is no purely logical, absolutely airtight justification for the belief that repeated patterns must endure. Induction is basically the process of extrapolating from specific observations, whether repeated experiments or daily experiences, into a general conclusion about what is likely to happen. We see the sun rise every day, so we infer it will rise on every subsequent morning. The paradox surfaces when we try to justify induction by invoking induction itself. It has always worked before, so it will work in the future as well. That circular reasoning does not offer a logically conclusive proof. Logically speaking, it is not impossible for the laws of nature to change abruptly, even if we find that idea extremely counterintuitive. Despite this philosophical dilemma, we depend on induction everywhere: science, cooking, traveling, virtually all aspects of daily life. Our faith in its reliability is reinforced by the fact that it has served us extremely well to date. Nevertheless, Hume's point persists. No matter how many times we observe the same outcome, that alone does not logically force it to continue indefinitely. The best we can say is that up to now it has worked out. Some thinkers propose a principle of the uniformity of nature, suggesting that nature does not spontaneously alter its behavior. But that principle itself is not grounded in logic alone, it is drawn from induction. Others maintain a practical stance. While we cannot prove induction with 100% certainty, it remains the most useful tool we have for making sense of the world. After all, nobody lives in perpetual fear that the laws of physics will spontaneously mutate tomorrow. We accept these laws because it is pragmatically our best bet. Hence, the problem of induction highlights that our deep-seated assumptions about consistency in nature rest on something less than absolute logic. That may not change our habits. Life continues with induction as its bedrock. But it is a crucial philosophical reminder about the fragility of what we call certainty. We realize that no matter how strongly experience supports a pattern, there is always the logical space for surprise. Far from rendering everyday life impossible, this reflection simply encourages humility. We carry on relying on induction, well aware that it is not, on a strict, logical basis, infallibly proven. Parfit's Teletransporter. Parfit's Teletransporter is a famous thought experiment devised by the philosopher Derek Parfit to question the core of personal identity. Suppose a futuristic device scans your entire body, every atom and neural connection, and then transmits all that information to a remote location, for instance Mars. On Mars, this device reconstructs a perfect copy of you with the exact same arrangement of atoms and the same memories. Meanwhile, the original body on Earth is destroyed as part of the procedure. From an outside perspective, it seems you have been teleported, one moment on Earth, the next on Mars, carrying on with all your traits. But does this truly preserve you, or does it kill you here and replace you with a replica over there? The paradox lies in whether identity consists merely in the continuity of memories and mental patterns, psychological continuity, or also in the uninterrupted existence of a particular physical organism. If you believe that identity springs from a stable chain of mental states, memories, personality, and consciousness, then, presumably, the person appearing on Mars with your memories and character is still you. If, however, you see your identity as inseparable from this specific physical body, you might argue that the procedure is actually lethal, and the new you is simply a copy, no matter how flawless. The dilemma becomes more intricate if something goes wrong and the earthly version is never destroyed. Now you have two individuals, each claiming to be the original you, equipped with the same past experiences. Which one is authentic? Parfit uses scenarios like this to argue that continuity of psychological features may matter more to identity than any single piece of matter. Under that view, if your mental pattern endures in one or more new bodies, it is still you in a meaningful sense. Of course, for many of us, that notion contradicts our deeply ingrained feeling that we are tied to this single body. Additionally, there is the subjective perspective question. If you climb into the teletransporter, do you sense any interruption? If you are the one stepping out on Mars, it might feel like an instantaneous shift. Meanwhile, your annihilated original on Earth never experiences a thing, having simply ceased to exist. Does that become a variation of suicide or a perfect continuity? Parfit's Teletransporter thus highlights how tenuous the idea of a consistent, unified self can be when tested by hypotheticals about copying and rematerializing people. Though no such teleportation technology exists today, the thought experiment resonates with modern debates about whether we could one day upload our minds to computers, or replicate them artificially. If we accept that identity rides solely on psychological continuity, the duplicates might be us. But if we hold that each mind is fundamentally embodied and physically continuous, no duplication, no matter how precise, would truly preserve who we are. That is why Parfit's Teletransporter remains such a potent challenge to everyday ideas about who we are and what it means to be the same person. The burden of proof paradox. The burden of proof paradox arises when discussing who must provide evidence to support or refute a claim. Conventionally, it falls to the person making an assertion, particularly an extraordinary one, to back it up with evidence rather than demand others prove it wrong. However, debates often see the burden of proof reversed. The individual advancing an unusual hypothesis may say, "Show me that I am mistaken," thereby shifting all responsibility onto the skeptic. This dynamic appears in everyday discussions and also in scientific or legal contexts. If someone insists, for example, invisible fairies live in my garden, it makes sense to say, "Please show me evidence." But if they respond, "Prove that they are not there," they are trying to sidestep the normal requirement for evidence by exploiting how hard it is to prove a negative. Lacking a universal proof of non-existence, one could never conclusively show the absence of invisible fairies. In the meantime, the original claim remains unsubstantiated. In science, the rule is that whoever puts forth a new or unconventional hypothesis has the burden of showing data to support it. This ensures a rigorous approach. If no convincing evidence emerges, the hypothesis is rejected. Similarly, in legal systems, the prosecution carries the burden of proof to demonstrate guilt. Demanding an accused person demonstrate their absolute innocence would be unworkable. The principle ensures fairness and avoids a scenario where anyone could allege anything without the need for substantiation. The paradox's central issue arises when both sides pass the burden of proof back and forth, creating a stalemate. Without a clear rule on who must provide evidence, endless "disprove me if you can" arguments arise, letting improbable ideas linger indefinitely. That is why the notion of burden of proof is vital for logical discourse. It prevents the proliferation of wild claims that remain immune to scrutiny simply because no one can definitively refute them. A further complexity is that not every claim demands the same level of support. When stating something mundane or consistent with established facts, the burden may be lower. But an extraordinary claim, contradicting what is widely understood, needs proportionately strong evidence. This logic, often summarized as "extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence," helps us avoid confusion between well-substantiated theories and mere speculation. Hence, the burden of proof paradox highlights a fundamental rule in honest debate. If you assert something new, outlandish, or lacking consensus, you must provide reasons and evidence. Otherwise, the discourse devolves into a round robin of "prove me wrong," under which no constructive progress can be made. Recognizing who holds the burden of proof not only keeps arguments grounded, but also fosters clarity, so that any claim, be it scientific, legal, or everyday, faces the scrutiny it deserves. The sleeping pill dilemma. Imagine there exists a pill capable of erasing a specific memory while you sleep. The question is whether you would be willing to take such a pill to eliminate a traumatic or deeply painful event from your mind. On the surface, it seems tempting: one swallow, and by the next morning that moment of suffering would vanish. However, this prospect raises a complex debate, as it touches on the importance of memories, both positive and negative, in shaping who we are. Some argue in favor of freeing oneself from anguish and heartbreak. A single traumatic event can lead to nightmares, anxiety, or serious emotional struggles, so completely forgetting it might promise genuine relief. At the same time, memories, no matter how distressing, often serve as valuable learning experiences. The hardships we endure can foster empathy, resilience, or awareness of possible dangers. Erasing them could deprive us of lessons that influence our future actions. It also raises the moral question of whether removing those experiences might lead us to repeat the same mistakes or lose vital parts of our personal growth. Another issue is that memories are not isolated fragments in our minds. They are woven into a web of associations involving emotions, relationships, and other recollections. Simply erasing one fragment may leave lingering after-effects like unexplained fear, trust issues, or a general sense of confusion. Then there is the ethical angle. In extreme cases, might a government or institution misuse such technology to manipulate citizens' memories, suppressing parts of history or personal identity? Also, from an individual standpoint, do we have the right to remove knowledge that might be significant to others, for instance in cases where testimony is crucial for seeking justice? This dilemma also resonates with the broader question of whether the painful chapters of our lives help define us as complete persons. In literature and film, when characters deliberately erase heartbreak or trauma, they sometimes forfeit the very experiences that gave depth or insight to their identity. Ultimately, the sleeping pill dilemma highlights a conflict between eradicating suffering and preserving the integrity of one's life story. It urges us to reflect on how much authority we should have over our own recollection and whether an existence purged of all negativity might end up vacant of essential parts of our humanity. The decision-making loop. The decision-making loop refers to that psychological trap where an individual gets stuck overanalyzing different choices, attempting to pick the absolute best option. Instead of settling on one path, the person keeps returning to the same pros and cons, never reaching a conclusion. This phenomenon, often described as analysis paralysis, can occur in both trivial scenarios like picking a restaurant and weighty decisions such as moving to a new city or changing jobs. One driving factor behind this loop is the fear of making the wrong choice. We often strive for the flawless decision that will maximize benefits and minimize costs or regrets. But in real life, perfection is rarely attainable. Every single option has trade-offs, and the pursuit of an ideal outcome can lead to perpetual indecision. Even after hours or days of deliberation, fresh doubts may emerge, leading to more questions about whether to reconsider, compare again, or start from scratch. Another psychological layer at play here is our quest for certainty. We hope to predict all possible results before acting, but the world is full of variables beyond our control. Searching for endless data in the hope of eliminating any risk can increase frustration, as each new piece of information sometimes adds complexity rather than clarity. Furthermore, failing to choose is itself a type of decision, one that often has its own pitfalls like lost opportunities or lingering anxiety. In group or organizational settings, this loop can result in stalled projects or delayed initiatives because people keep returning to the discussion stage, awaiting absolute proof that a plan will work without flaws. Yet the cost of inaction may become higher than taking a modest risk. Recognizing this pattern, many recommend strategies such as establishing strict deadlines, focusing on top priorities, or accepting that any choice entails some level of uncertainty. Essentially, the decision-making loop reminds us that striving for a perfectly rational solution can be self-defeating. Sometimes the best approach is to gather sufficient information without overloading ourselves and then trust our judgment. Even if the choice proves imperfect, moving forward typically provides more learning and growth than staying in an indefinite holding pattern. This understanding helps balance thoughtful analysis with the readiness to act. The Conflict of Omnibenevolence. The Conflict of Omnibenevolence explores the tension between the existence of evil and the idea of a supreme being, often called God, who is infinitely good, all-powerful, and all-knowing. It can be phrased as a classic question. If such a being truly has limitless power and knowledge and is absolutely benevolent, Why then does evil, suffering, and injustice persist in the world? One traditional response invokes free will. The argument goes that for goodness to be genuine, creatures must be able to choose evil as well, thus explaining human cruelty or wrongdoing. Without freedom, moral virtue would be meaningless. However, this stance does not fully address suffering arising from non-human causes, such as earthquakes, diseases, or catastrophic events. If a benevolent and all-powerful being can prevent natural disasters, why do they still happen? Other theologies or philosophies hold that what we perceive as evil might serve a higher, incomprehensible plan, and that mortal beings cannot grasp the ultimate reason. Still, this is unsatisfying for many, especially when faced with immense suffering of innocent lives. Atheists or skeptics sometimes use this issue as an argument that no such omnibenevolent, omnipotent deity exists. They assert that the reality of unmerited pain and cruelty in the world contradicts a caretaker deity who is both wholly good and all-powerful. A range of nuanced stances attempt to reconcile the puzzle by redefining benevolence or power. Some suggest that God chooses not to intervene constantly, preserving an autonomous world. Others claim human perspective is too narrow, implying that everything works out for a greater good eventually, though this is difficult to prove. Beyond theological discussions, the presence of evil also forces us to reflect on ethics, compassion, and the nature of moral responsibility in a world where tragedy seems widespread. Ultimately, the conflict of omnibenevolence remains unresolved, compelling believers, skeptics, and philosophers alike to grapple with why a presumably good cosmos holds such deep suffering. Whether one views it as a profound mystery of faith, a challenge to traditional doctrines, or evidence against divinity itself, the issue stands as a pivotal discussion about goodness, freedom, and the harsh realities we witness in our shared existence. The duck rabbit problem. The duck rabbit is an image that can be interpreted as a duck's head, or alternatively, as a rabbit's head, depending on how one focuses on the same set of lines. Initially, a viewer might see only the duck, then suddenly perceive a rabbit upon being prompted, or vice versa. This phenomenon has less to do with changing the drawing, nothing shifts physically, and more with how our minds reorganize visual information in different ways. In psychology, this figure is often cited to demonstrate the brain's ability to interpret ambiguous stimuli. Once we realize it can be seen as two animals, the mind can switch back and forth. Such bistable perception highlights that humans don't passively register images, we actively construct them based on patterns and mental expectations. The duck-rabbit problem is thus not about determining which animal is correct, but rather about how our subjective perception can flip given the same external input. Philosophers and cognitive scientists often use the duck-rabbit as a metaphor for broader conceptual shifts. In moral or political debates, two sides might examine the same data or event and come away with starkly different conclusions. Neither is necessarily deceived, they are simply emphasizing different gestalt aspects of the facts. Recognizing that the same lines can yield multiple valid interpretations can foster intellectual humility and empathy in discussions. Moreover, the duck-rabbit underscores the notion of gestalt switching, a sudden reorganization of the perceptual field that changes one's understanding. After noticing the two interpretations, an observer can't help but see both, toggling at will. This directly challenges the idea that perception is immutable or purely driven by the external stimulus. It depends heavily on context, mental frameworks, and learned patterns. In broader life contexts, the duck-rabbit phenomenon suggests that many conflicts or misunderstandings might be akin to seeing just a duck or just a rabbit, when in fact there could be multiple perspectives that hold some legitimacy. Embracing this dual viewpoint doesn't lead to relativism as much as it leads to a deeper acknowledgement that human perception can be flexible. By shifting angles or receiving subtle cues, we uncover entirely different ways of organizing the same reality. Hence, the duck-rabbit problem does more than amuse with a clever optical illusion. It reminds us that the process of perception is inherently interpretive, that data alone can be ambiguous, and that our mindset heavily shapes the reality we see. The power in recognizing how effortlessly our mind can jump between seemingly contradictory viewpoints is a powerful lesson in the complexity and subjectivity underlying human experience. The circular time paradox. The circular time paradox introduces the idea that time might not flow in a straight line from an unrepeatable past toward an open future, but rather could repeat itself in endless cycles, returning over and over to the same starting point. This vision stands in stark contrast to the usual notion of history as a trajectory that begins perhaps with the Big Bang and unfolds without retracing its steps. In the scenario of circular time, everything that happens in the universe, including each individual life, has already taken place before and will occur again indefinitely. Various ancient cultures embraced cyclical views of the cosmos. In some mythologies, including certain Hindu traditions, eras, yugas, follow one after another in a recurring pattern. In ancient Greek thought, some philosophers posited the idea of cosmic cycles, in which the universe repeatedly undergoes creation and destruction. In modern philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche made popular the notion of the eternal return. Imagine that, after death or after eons pass, your life starts again precisely as it was. Every decision, every pain, every joy would replay identically, an infinite number of times. The paradox arises when one considers how cyclical time fits with our subjective sense of novelty and progress. If reality simply loops, repeating precisely the same sequence, then free will might vanish, as would the possibility of true innovation. All your conversations, scientific discoveries, relationships, and mistakes would perpetually reoccur, suggesting that no genuine advancement can exist, only an eternal loop. For many, that undermines the idea of personal growth or evolution, since everything is foreordained to happen again without variation. A striking reflection comes from Nietzsche's eternal return. If you knew you had to relive every instant eternally, how would that change your approach to life? If you love your existence, you might find it uplifting to experience it an infinite number of times. If you suffer deeply, it might feel like an unending curse. There is a possible motivational angle here, the notion that you should live each moment in a manner you could willingly repeat forever. In science, a handful of theories have examined whether the universe could be cyclic, such as models involving a Big Bang, Big Crunch cycle, where the cosmos expands, eventually contracts, and then re-expands. If the conditions recurred in a precisely identical manner, time would presumably reset to the same initial state, leading to an exact repetition. However, mainstream modern physics suggests that our universe expands at an accelerating rate, making a simple, cyclical rebound improbable. Even if a cycle existed, minute differences could accumulate to produce substantial changes, and thus the same events might not replicate exactly. An additional puzzle concerns memory. If you truly have lived this same life countless times, why can't you recall earlier cycles? One might propose that each reset erases awareness, so that everything feels fresh. Then again, from a subjective standpoint, living in a perfect cycle without recollection is functionally similar to a linear existence. Popular culture frequently employs variations on this theme. For example, narratives where characters relive the same day repeatedly. Those stories often highlight both the monotony that ensues once you realize everything repeats, and the paradox of generating novelty in a locked loop. Typically, these fictional treatments allow a memory of previous cycles, which counters the idea of a purely cyclical cosmos that starts again with no recollection. Ultimately, the circular time paradox challenges our fundamental sense of progression. If all has happened before and will recur an infinite number of times, free will and history's forward march may appear illusory. It offers a viewpoint in which time's flow might be more like a ring turning endlessly upon itself, leaving us with the unsettling yet provocative notion that every deed and every moment might cycle on forever. That blend of poetry and disquiet makes the paradox one of the most intriguing contemplations of how we conceive time, and the possibility that our conventional past-to-future perspective might be only one among many. The preference paradox. The preference paradox emerges when our choices fail to adhere to logical consistency or transitivity. In theoretical models, transitivity means that if you prefer A over B and B over C, you should prefer A over C when faced with a direct comparison. However, empirical research reveals that people can and do display contradictory selections. Someone might rank A above B, B above C, yet unexpectedly select C over A in a different context. At first glance, it seems irrational. How can an individual support that chain of preferences logically? One reason this happens is that human decision-making often depends on context and framing, rather than on a stable list of hierarchical values. Psychological and economic experiments show that reordering or reframing the options can lead people to shift their preferences. A minor change, like introducing a third alternative that is clearly worse in one aspect, but similar to one of the main choices, can swing decisions in surprising ways. This is sometimes labeled the decoy effect. Even though the new option is not actually better, its presence influences how individuals perceive the original two. These inconsistencies underline that we are not perfectly rational agents in the sense once assumed by classical economics. Instead, we are creatures whose choices are guided by emotions, fleeting circumstances, and subconscious judgments. Many times we have contradictory motivations. We might prefer convenience over cost in one setting, only to prioritize cost over convenience in another. When our separate decisions get compared, it becomes clear that our chain of preferences forms loops or cycles rather than a neat ranking. In everyday life, we can witness this phenomenon in simple scenarios like deciding between staying home, going to a party, or exercising. You may say you'd rather stay home than go out, prefer going out rather than working out, and yet in direct competition you prefer working out instead of staying home. Each pairwise preference is plausible given particular circumstances, yet they create an overall paradoxical loop when considered together. This paradox also brings forward how marketing and policy can influence behaviors. By changing how options are presented, altering labels, using comparisons, or adding inferior choices, organizations can modify the public's stated preferences. Additionally, the phenomenon plays a role in politics, where the sequence of questions or the arrangement of data can sway voters. Recognizing these patterns helps us realize how fragile and malleable our judgments often are. From a personal standpoint, studying the preference paradox could improve our self-awareness. If we see that our preferences sometimes clash or shift unpredictably, we can ask which factors truly matter most to us and seek more stable decision criteria. Even so, it is important to accept a measure of inconsistency as part of being human. We operate with evolving emotional states, limited time, and diverse influences. Ultimately, the preference paradox highlights that our choice architecture is not a simple linear structure. Instead, the interplay of emotions, perceptions, and context can generate cyclical preferences, challenging the notion that we always pursue coherent and stable goals. Rather than being purely irrational, these results show the complexity of human nature, where multiple value systems coexist and occasionally clash, generating preference loops that puzzle both the individual decision-maker and theoretical models alike. The Twin Earth thought experiment, often attributed to philosopher Hilary Putnam, asks us to envision an Earth-like planet, nearly identical in every detail of culture, language, technology, and natural environment. The twist is that their water differs in chemical composition from H2O. Let's say it has formula XYZ, yet it looks, tastes, and functions much the same, quenching thirst, irrigating fields, filling oceans, and so forth. For the inhabitants of Twin Earth, that liquid is simply water, just as ours is on Earth. But are they talking about the same substance we call water? This scenario probes the philosophy of language, specifically how words manage to refer to real entities. If Earth's water is chemically H2O, while the Twin Earth's is XYZ, does water still point to the same concept, or is it effectively a different thing? One approach insists that water necessarily means H2O. Thus, the Twin Earth's fluid, despite its superficial similarity, is not truly water. Another approach contends that if everything about its appearance and usage matches, then it is effectively water for that civilization, and the difference in molecular structure is irrelevant to everyday reference. This thought experiment illustrates a key feature of externalist theories of meaning, which argue that reference depends partly on real-world factors beyond mere mental concepts. Even if the Twin Earth inhabitants have the same internal idea of wet, transparent liquid, their water references a different chemical substance, so their word might diverge in meaning from our water. Putnam's broader argument is that meaning is not solely determined by an individual's mental content, but also by how words hook up to the external environment. Beyond the notion of water, the Twin Earth scenario extends to questions of identity and definition. If everything seems identical but the underlying nature is distinct, do we really have a perfect duplicate? Suppose you replicate a person with subtle bodily or historical discrepancies. Would that copy remain the same individual or something new? The idea is that underlying properties, like chemical makeup, may affect whether two things are truly identical, even if they appear and function the same at a glance. This has implications for how we regard language and knowledge. If our use of the word water is entwined with genuine H2O, then if we were unwittingly dealing with something else all along, we would be mistaken. Meanwhile, for the Twin Earth folks, water might simply mean the liquid that does all the tasks water does, irrespective of formula. Critics point out that it's a hypothetical scenario that tests how we might treat reference in a more complicated world. Some see it as showing that what we think a word means can diverge from what it actually picks out in reality. The Twin Earth argument has significantly influenced discussions of semantics and mind, raising the possibility that our environment shapes meaning more than we realize. It highlights that a term's significance can't be fully separated from what that term interacts with physically. Even if no one can detect the difference, since XYZ and H2O look and act identically, the underlying chemical distinction remains. Ultimately, the Twin Earth thought experiment challenges any simplistic notion that meaning resides solely in mental images or experiences, calling attention to how real-world structures anchor the language we use to describe and navigate the world. The Hedonism Paradox. The Hedonism Paradox asserts that the more we chase happiness or pleasure as our primary conscious goal, the less likely we are to attain real, lasting contentment. At first, this sounds counterintuitive. Would not focusing on pleasure lead us to experience it more often? Yet both philosophical reflection and psychological research indicate that constantly evaluating whether one is happy can become a significant obstacle to genuine well-being. One reason is that happiness is typically a byproduct of other pursuits. People often discover that when they immerse themselves in a passion, learning an instrument, nurturing a relationship, or contributing to a community, they experience joy almost spontaneously rather than by design. On the other hand, a person who wakes up every day thinking, "I must be happy at all costs," may scan each moment for signs of insufficiency. Even minor disappointments loom larger than usual because they threaten the declared mission of continuous bliss. A related concept is hedonic adaptation. When we obtain something we have long desired, our initial excitement gradually fades, bringing us back toward our habitual level of mood or satisfaction. If happiness is our only explicit objective, we become locked in a cycle, continually craving new hits of pleasure to restore that sensation of novelty. Over time, this can prove exhausting. Meanwhile, those whose motivation arises from intrinsic values, such as creativity, emotional connection, or helping others, frequently report deeper, more stable contentment, even if it's less dramatic day to day. This paradox has been highlighted by philosophical traditions over centuries. Epicurus argued for a moderate pleasure anchored in tranquility, rather than an endless hunt for intense highs. Schopenhauer wrote that incessant desire leads to constant frustration, and once satisfied, the thrill subsides, leaving boredom in its place. Contemporary psychology points to similar conclusions. Individuals dedicated to meaningful goals or flow states, intense absorption in fulfilling tasks, tend to feel more satisfaction than those who systematically measure their own happiness level. The paradox speaks not to denigrate pleasure, but to caution against making it the central conscious mission. That approach can breed anxiety as we fret about every fleeting emotion. When small adversities arise, they feel catastrophic because they block the ideal of uninterrupted joy. In contrast, devoting oneself to activities deemed worthwhile for their own sake, like forming deep human bonds, practicing compassion, or pursuing personal growth, often yields long-term satisfaction. Happiness slips in through the side door, so to speak, instead of being forcibly summoned. Additionally, the hedonism paradox can be spotted in real-life anecdotes. People who fixate on external symbols of pleasure, luxury items, constant leisure, or public acclaim, may discover fleeting euphoria but struggle with enduring well-being. Meanwhile, those who embrace steady, values-driven routines, investing in relationships, health, or creativity, frequently describe a more anchored sense of happiness that endures ups and downs. Hence, the paradox implies that at times, the most potent way to capture contentment is not by aiming at it directly, but by committing wholeheartedly to other endeavors. Like trying to hold on to water by squeezing, the harder we grip happiness as a conscious aim, the more it escapes. The hedonism paradox is thus a reminder that real satisfaction thrives when we engage life deeply, without making happiness itself the absolute measure of every choice. The paradox of Buridan's donkey. This paradox, traditionally linked to the French philosopher Jean Buridan, presents a seemingly simple scenario that raises profound questions about decision-making and free will. Picture a donkey placed at an equal distance between two identical bales of hay. Both options look equally appealing, they have the same size, the same smell, and both are the same distance away. The paradox proposes that, lacking a clear reason to favor one bale over the other, the donkey might remain stuck in indecision and starve to death. At first glance, this might appear like a playful anecdote. However, the core of the paradox revolves around how a purely rational being, or animal, can break a perfect tie. If there is no factor, no difference in hunger level or subtle preference, that tips the balance, then purely logical reasoning does not provide a decisive argument. The donkey's dilemma exemplifies how, in theory, a total symmetry of choices could paralyze action. For philosophers in the medieval period, it was a way of illustrating the limits of rational choice. Some argued that the donkey, or a human in a similar predicament, would need at least a small push from something beyond mere reason, a spontaneous whim, an emotional impulse, or even a random coin toss. Without it, the rational mind might never decide, because reason alone finds no greater justification for one side versus the other. Translating this into human terms, one sees how we often confront decisions that seem balanced. Though in reality, conditions are rarely perfectly equal, the fable highlights the idea that rational thinking may falter in a deadlock. Another angle is that we almost always have subtle biases or intangible preferences that break the tie without our being fully aware of them. We might, for instance, unconsciously lean to the left or recall a past good experience with one of the options. In discussions about free will, some interpret Buridan's donkey as hinting that free will requires the ability to choose arbitrarily beyond rational or utilitarian calculations. Others counter that absolute symmetry never truly occurs in real life. There is always a slightest difference, maybe a fraction of a step, that resolves the impasse. Philosophically, this story underlines how decision-making can involve more than just logic. It may involve impulses or random triggers. Ultimately, the donkey's scenario is rarely taken literally, but rather as a symbol for the complexity of choice. If everything were equal, and if pure logic alone were the guide, we might face an endless loop of indecision. That the donkey might starve dramatizes the cost of wanting perfect, rational justification. One might conclude that living beings, including humans, rely on subconscious or emotional nudges to act when reason alone remains neutral. This paradox, therefore, reminds us that perfect symmetry can be stifling, emphasizing the importance of some element beyond cold logic to initiate decisions in day-to-day life. The Paradox of Omnipotence. The Paradox of Omnipotence appears in various forms, but a familiar version is, could an all-powerful being create a stone so heavy that even this being cannot lift it? If the answer is yes, that being cannot lift the stone, thus failing to be all-powerful. But if the answer is no, that means it cannot create such a stone, so again it seems not omnipotent. In either case, it looks like true omnipotence is undermined. Historically, this puzzle emerged in theological and philosophical debates on the nature of God. A truly omnipotent entity is often described as capable of doing absolutely anything, and yet the paradox raises the question, are there logical constraints even on a supreme power? Some argue that a statement like, create a stone too heavy to be lifted by an omnipotent being, is inherently self-contradictory, similar to create a square circle. Consequently, they say an omnipotent being is not required to perform tasks that are logically impossible. Omnipotence covers everything logically coherent, but does not extend to self-contradictory acts. Others push the idea that a being of infinite power should transcend all logical rules, but that position usually runs up against the notion that contradictions are not valid tasks. More moderate theologians and philosophers often define omnipotence in a narrower sense, stating that an all-powerful being can do any logically consistent action, but not what is logically paradoxical. So the phrase, a stone so heavy that an omnipotent being cannot lift it, is dismissed as a nonsensical combination of words. Meanwhile, some skeptics see the paradox as a direct critique of divine omnipotence, claiming it shows the notion is incoherent. Still, the common response is that these sorts of contradictory sentences do not describe genuine possibilities and thus do not pose a real threat to the concept of God's power. Beyond theology, this thought experiment highlights the boundaries of language and reason. We can string words together, but sometimes they yield statements containing internal contradictions. Even outside religion, the paradox of omnipotence points out that the concept of doing anything needs to be carefully delimited. If anything includes the logically impossible, we stumble into nonsense. If it excludes contradictions, we then see omnipotence as power over all coherent realities, not over illogical proposals. Hence, the paradox of omnipotence delivers two main insights. It challenges the naive interpretation that being all-powerful means no limits whatsoever under any conditions, and it demonstrates that logic itself acts as a boundary on what can or cannot be done. In religious debates, it has forced nuanced definitions of God's omnipotence. Philosophically, it underscores how we must watch out for apparent statements that conceal contradictions, reminding us that real power is not about violating logic but about encompassing every coherent possibility. The Brain in a Vat. The Brain in a Vat is a classic thought experiment used in discussions of epistemology, the theory of knowledge, and the philosophy of mind. Picture a scenario where your brain, removed from your body, floats in a vat of nutrients that keep it functional. Meanwhile, it is connected to a supercomputer that sends signals replicating all the sensory information you would normally receive if you had a real body interacting with the physical world. Despite having no actual limbs or external environment, you would believe you were walking, talking, touching objects, and living an ordinary life, all through carefully orchestrated stimuli. This possibility reveals a fundamental challenge. How can you be certain you are not just a brain in a vat, deceived by artificial inputs? Everything you think you experience, from seeing the sky to tasting your food, could theoretically come from a program feeding your neurons illusions. The question extends to radical skepticism. Is there any conclusive way to rule out that our entire world is just a sophisticated simulation? Philosopher Hilary Putnam highlighted that this scenario raises dilemmas about the reference of our words. If your brain never truly encounters real trees or real tables, how do your words like tree or table acquire meaning? This leads to a debate between internalists, those who think meaning is purely in the mind, and externalists, who argue meaning depends partly on interaction with the world. If everything is an elaborate simulation, you are not referring to actual trees in an actual outside environment, but only to illusions generated by the computer. Some attempt to dismiss the brain in a vat scenario by saying it is self-refuting. To conceive, "I'm just a brain in a vat," might presuppose having genuine contact with reality. Nonetheless, many hold that logically we cannot absolutely exclude the possibility. Similar ideas appear in pop culture and films, like The Matrix, spotlighting the concept that sense perception could be faked so convincingly that we could never detect the manipulation. The key philosophical outcome is a heightened awareness of the limits of our knowledge. We rely on our senses to inform us of an external world, but if these inputs were artificially produced, we would have no direct means to notice. We often dismiss such extreme skepticism because it is not pragmatically helpful. Day-to-day life proceeds on the assumption that we deal with a tangible, consistent environment. Yet the brain in a vat hypothesis persists as a cautionary tale. It illustrates how, in principle, our perceptions might be entirely constructed, calling into question what we confidently label reality and prodding us to reflect on whether we can ever be fully certain of the world we experience. Laplace's demon. Laplace's demon is a thought experiment proposed by the mathematician and astronomer Pierre-Simon Laplace in the early 19th century. Laplace imagined a hypothetical entity that knows, at a given moment, the precise position and velocity of every particle in the universe, along with all the physical laws governing them. With that perfect data and the right mathematical tools, the entity, the demon, could, in theory, predict the entire future course of events and explain the past with absolute precision. This scenario encapsulates a strong version of determinism. Given the state of the cosmos at one instant, everything that will happen is already fixed, if only you have enough knowledge to calculate it. The question is whether such comprehensive prediction is truly feasible. In classical Newtonian physics, one might assume, yes, with correct equations and infinite computational power, the demon could foresee everything from planetary orbits to human choices. However, modern science has introduced quantum uncertainty and chaos theory. Quantum mechanics proposes inherent unpredictabilities at small scales, while chaos theory shows that tiny deviations in initial conditions can magnify drastically, making long-term predictions extremely sensitive. As a result, most scientists today view Laplace's demon more as an idealized notion than a practical reality. From a philosophical angle, Laplace's demon highlights the debate on free will. If the demon can foresee every decision, our sense of freedom might be challenged. We would essentially be acting out predetermined trajectories. Determinists claim that everything is indeed set by the state of the universe plus the laws of nature, meaning that if one had those conditions pinned down, the entire future would follow. Others note that quantum indeterminacy and the emergent complexities of chaotic systems limit such absolute predestination, though randomness alone may not suffice to ensure meaningful freedom. Another layer arises when we consider whether the demon is part of the universe it analyzes. Could it predict its own actions? If so, there might be paradoxes about self-prediction, akin to time travel contradictions or knowledge of future conundrums. In a purely deterministic framework, one might respond that even the demon's revelations are themselves determined, so there is no paradox. But this moves the discourse further into the territory of philosophical reflection about self-reference and determinism. Historically, Laplace's demon epitomized the confidence in a clockwork universe, the idea that knowing the present with infinite detail would let you deduce the future. Today, physics acknowledges that measurement accuracy is limited by quantum principles and that chaos amplifies minute unknowns. This recognition suggests that the demon's total knowledge remains out of reach, underscoring that the theoretical possibility of perfect determinism is distinct from its practical impossibility. At a conceptual level, the demon underscores the tension between those who conceive reality as fully calculable in principle and those who maintain that uncertainty and complexity render such perfect calculation nonsensical. Moreover, it challenges us to think about how we interpret free will. If we lived in a thoroughly deterministic cosmos, would we be mere marionettes of physical law, or is there room for self-directed agency? Even if the demon is improbable or impossible, the thought experiment continues to be a touchstone in discussions of determinism, predictability, and the nature of scientific explanation.